Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for being here today. When we hear the word tradition, our minds immediately conjure up images of ancient rituals, timeless customs, and practices that have been handed down from generation to generation since the dawn of time. We assume that the royal pageantry we see on television, the national costumes we admire, and the holidays we celebrate are ancient relics. But today, I'm going to present a concept that might completely shatter that assumption. I'm going to show you that many of the traditions we consider to be ancient are in fact quite recent inventions. Some of them were deliberately manufactured during the industrial era. Please look at the diagram on our first slide, the mechanism of tradition synthesis. Think of this as a factory assembly line. On the left, we have our inputs or raw materials, historical facts, ancient fragments, and folklore. These materials are fed into the process of what we call the ritualization engine. Here, through a process of repetition, the attachment of new symbolism, and deliberate modification, the raw materials are engineered. Finally, on the right, the factory outputs the product, a manufactured continuity or an invented tradition. Notice the context at the top of the diagram, 1870s to 1914s. This was a period of rapid and profound social transformation. Why did humanity suddenly start mass producing traditions during this specific window of industrialization? That is the mystery we are going to unravel today. To truly understand this phenomenon, we must first define our terms. Slide 2 provides a typology of social practices, mapping them on two axes, flexibility and symbolic load. In the top left quadrant, we have custom. Custom is organic, adaptive, and serves as the motor of daily life. Think of the common law or the traditional farming practices of a rural village. Custom is highly flexible. It adapts to practical needs. It is like the engine and the flywheel of traditional societies. In the bottom left, we have routine or convention. This is purely functional and technical, carrying zero symbolic meaning. Think of factory shift schedules or wearing a hard hat on a construction site. If a better method comes along, the routine is immediately discarded. But look at the bottom right quadrant, invented tradition. What distinguishes tradition is its invariance. Tradition is fixed, formalized, and carries a very high symbolic and ritual load. While custom adapts to practical needs, tradition enforces repetition to create ideological cohesion. Let me give you a classic example, the wig worn by British judges. In the 18th century, wearing a wig was just a custom, a fashion choice adapted for warmth and style. But when everyone else in society stopped wearing wigs, judges were required to keep wearing them. The wig lost its practical function and gained a purely symbolic one, representing the invariant majesty of the law. That is the differentiation protocol. Custom adapts, tradition enforces invariance. So what triggers a society to invent traditions? Slide 3 illustrates the Hobsbawm Catalyst, a process model named after the brilliant historian Eric Hobsbawm. During Phase A, roughly between 1870s and 1914s, the world was hit by three massive catalysts: industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of mass electorates. Millions of people left their ancestral villages to work in giant, anonymous city factories. The working classes were suddenly gaining the right to vote. This leads directly to Phase B, the rupture. Organic social bonds were shattered. The old legitimacies, like the divine right of kings or the natural authority of the local landlord, completely failed. The ruling classes suddenly found themselves facing a massive, newly enfranchised, and potentially dangerous urban population. To prevent society from collapsing, we enter Phase C, the artificial repair. New traditions had to be synthetically manufactured to serve as a social glue. As the slide shows, these invented traditions had three main functions: to build social cohesion among new groups, to provide legitimation for shaken authorities, and to ensure the socialization of beliefs and values. As Hobsbawm noted, We should expect invented traditions to appear most frequently when a rapid transformation of society destroys the old social patterns. Let's move from theory to some shocking historical realities. Slide 4 presents our first case study, the Scottish Highland Tradition. The mechanism at play here is retrospective invention. When we think of Scotland, we immediately picture a Highlander wearing a tartan kilt and playing the bagpipes. We assume this is the ancient indigenous culture of the Scottish people. But in reality, this ancient culture is a retrospective fabrication designed to distinguish Scotland from Ireland. Before the year 1700, the culture of the Western Highlands was essentially an overflow of Irish culture. They wore long Irish shirts and simple brown mantles, and there were no specific clan tartans. So where did the famous short kilt, the feedback, come from? Around the year 1727, an English Quaker industrialist named Thomas Rawlinson opened an ironworks in the Highlands. He noticed that his Scottish workers were wearing the traditional bulky belted plaid, which was incredibly dangerous around factory machinery. To improve factory safety and efficiency, Rawlinson simply hired a tailor to cut the traditional garment in half, creating the modern short kilt. Yes, the ultimate symbol of ancient Scottish identity was actually invented by an English factory owner as industrial workwear. The fabrication didn't stop there. In 1760, James Macpherson published the epic poetry of Ossian, claiming it was an ancient Celtic masterpiece. It was later exposed as a massive literary forgery. Finally, the beloved clan tartans were codified in 1829 by two brothers, the Sobieski Stuarts, who produced a completely forged manuscript called the Vestiarium Scoticum. Driven by Victorian commercialism and a massive pageant organized by Sir Walter Scott in 1822, these modern inventions were successfully sold to the world as ancient Scottish heritage. Let's look at slide 5, the Welsh Revival. Here, the mechanism is mythological grafting. In the 18th century, genuine Welsh culture and the Welsh language were in steep decline, facing total assimilation by England. This cultural crisis served as the catalyst. In reaction against this English encroachment, a group of Welsh patriots decided they needed to save their identity. The primary engineer of this revival was a brilliantly eccentric stonemason and poet named Edward Williams, better known by his bardic name Iolo Morganwg. Iolo was fascinated by ancient Druids, but instead of just researching them, he simply invented a completely new Druidic religion. In 1792, on Primrose Hill in London, he founded the Gorset of Bards, a society complete with fabricated rituals, robes, and even an invented mystic symbol called the nod ciphering. In the 19th century, Iolo successfully grafted his fabricated mythology onto the Eisteddfod, a traditional Welsh poetry competition. Today, the Eisteddfod is the cornerstone of Welsh cultural identity, deeply infused with the Druidic rituals Iolo invented. Even the famous Welsh lady costume, the tall black hat and red cloak, was not an ancient Celtic dress. It was actually a standardized version of a 17th century English country outfit, actively promoted by Lady Llanover in the 1830s to give Wales a distinctive visual identity. Now let us turn our attention to the British monarchy on slide 6. The mechanism here is inverse compensation. Please look at figure 5, which charts political power versus ritual grandeur over time. In the early 19th century, monarchs like George IV and William IV still wielded significant executive and political power. However, during this period, their public rituals were notoriously inept. The coronation of George IV was almost a comedy, and William IV tried to cancel his coronation altogether. This was known as the Black Book era, a time when the monarchy was deeply unpopular and its ceremonies were chaotic. But as the 19th century progressed, the expansion of democratic voting rights stripped the monarchy of its actual political power. Yet, inversely, as executive power declined, the ritual grandeur of the monarchy was massively expanded to compensate. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the monarchy was reinvented as a politically neutral, stabilizing head of nation. Starting with Queen Victoria being proclaimed Empress of India in 1877, the state began inventing magnificent new traditions, grand royal jubilees, highly choreographed state openings of parliament, and the majestic royal weddings. Great composers like Edward Elgar were brought in to provide soaring, emotional musical cohesion for these events. The modern, flawless British royal pageantry we admire today is not 1,000 years old. It is a meticulously engineered product of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This mass production of tradition was also exported overseas. Look at slide 7, Imperial India. The mechanism used by the British here was feudalization. Following the Indian Mutiny of 1857, the British Crown took direct control of India. The British faced a daunting task. How do you legitimize foreign rule over hundreds of millions of people? Their solution was to construct a Victorian feudal order that had never actually existed in India in order to incorporate Indian elites into the British hierarchy. This culminated in the spectacular Imperial Assemblage of 1877 in Delhi, organized by Viceroy Lord Lytton. The event was designed to formally proclaim Queen Victoria as the Empress of India, establishing a rigid, invented taxonomy. As you can see on the organizational chart, the Empress sat at the top, followed by the Viceroy, and beneath him were the newly feudalized Indian princes. The British abolished the native Indian rituals of exchanging gold coins and robes, replacing them with medieval European symbols. They designed European-style coats of arms for Indian Maharajas, established a strict hierarchy of gun salutes, ranging from 101 guns down to 0, and created new orders of knighthood like the Star of India. It was a completely artificial hierarchy designed to make Indian princes feel like loyal feudal vassals to a British queen. Moving to slide 8, we see another colonial context, colonial Africa. Here, the mechanism is institutional isomorphism. When the British established their administration in Africa, they didn't have an existing imperial structure like the Mughal Empire to co-opt. So they simply exported the neo-traditions they had just invented back in Europe directly into the African landscape. As the diagram shows, they exported a public school, the regiment, and the monarchy. For example, they founded the King's College Budo in Uganda, meticulously copying the hierarchy of prefects and schoolhouses found in elite English public schools. They formed the King's African Rifles, dressing African soldiers in kilts and training them to march to brass bands. However, the brilliant historian Terence Ranger proposed what we call the Ranger hypothesis. He noted that Africans did not just passively absorb these exported traditions, they appropriated them for their own purposes. A perfect example is the Beni dance societies in East Africa, where local Africans created dance troops mirroring European military ranks from corporals up to admirals, using the colonizers' own aesthetic to build their own independent social networks and subtly mock colonial authority. Returning to Europe, slide 9 shows the macro-level system scaling, the mass production of traditions between 1870s and 1914s. With the sudden rise of the mass electorate, ruling elites realized that traditional social bonds were dead. They desperately needed new civic religions to ensure the loyalty of the masses to the nation-state. Therefore, states began to mass-produce standardized components of nation building. Look at the 4 components. First, the symbol. This era saw the rise of Flagolatry, the worship of the national flag and the institutionalization of national anthems. In France, singing the Marseillaise became compulsory in schools. Second, the idol. States embarked on massive campaigns to build statues and towers. France erected busts of Marianne in every town, while Germany built hundreds of Bismarck towers to anchor national memory in stone. Third, the holiday. National rituals and secular holidays were officially invented. France created Bastille Day in 1880, and Germany established Sedan Day. Finally, the socialization. The most powerful tool was primary education used by the state to impose a single national language, teach a sanitized version of national history, and transform peasants into loyal patriots. But the state was not the only entity inventing traditions. Slide 10 introduces the counter system. Just as the bourgeois state was inventing traditions from the top down, the newly formed labor and radical movements were doing the exact same thing from the bottom up. What we see is a remarkable parallel evolution of state and labor traditions. While the state had its royal jubilees and national anthems, the labor movement invented May Day in 1890. May Day evolved almost instantly from a one-time strike for an 8-hour workday into an annual quasi-religious ritual for the working class, a proletarian Easter. While the state had its top hats and military uniforms, the radical movements developed their own iconography, singing the International, carrying massive Union banners, and adopting the flat cap as the universal visual badge of working class solidarity. Radical movements successfully replicated the exact mechanisms of tradition to forge unbreakable class cohesion. We have looked at Scotland, Wales, the monarchy, India, Africa, and the labor movement. Now, let us synthesize this on slide 11, the function of the past. Here we have a cybernetic model of invented tradition. It operates as a feedback loop. At node 1, we experience modern flux and change. Industrialization and globalization destroy the old ways of living. This inevitably leads to node 2, anxiety and a void. People feel lost, and authorities feel insecure. To fill this void, society moves to node 3, invented tradition. We artificially construct symbolic continuity with a historical past. The core function of this, the green circle in the center, is legitimacy. By draping new realities in old costumes, we legitimize new power structures. This leads to node 4, social stability and cohesion, which allows the society to survive the next wave of modern flux. This brings us to our grand conclusion. Invented tradition is a symptom of the modern world, not a relic of the ancient one. We do not study these traditions just to debunk them. We study them to understand exactly how modern societies manage to maintain stability and psychological comfort amidst terrifying, relentless change. Slide 12 outlines the data sources and references. The insights I've shared today are deeply indebted to the groundbreaking 1983 anthology, The Invention of Tradition, edited by Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger, published by Cambridge University Press. From Hugh Trevor Roper's brilliant deconstruction of the Scottish Highlands, to David Canadine's analysis of British royal rituals, to the profound insights on India and Africa by Bernard Cohn and Terence Ranger, this scholarship completely changes how we view our cultural heritage. I hope that the next time you see a royal procession, hear a national anthem, or see a tartan kilt, you will look at it through a new lens. Ask yourself, is this an ancient legacy, or is it a brilliant invention of the modern age? Thank you very much for your time and attention today. Bye-bye.